Hello, and welcome to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. My name is Derek McCush. Indigenous communities throughout the world usually take water directly from rivers, ponds, streams, wells, or springs, and this often requires people, mainly the women of the community, to carry the water from sources distant from their homes. A recent report to the UN Human Rights Council stated that one of the biggest barriers to Indigenous peoples' access to water and sanitation is that many countries deny the very existence of their Indigenous people, or they just ignore them. In this episode of Human Rights Magazine, and its companion article in the Upstream Journal, Ciara Balhi explores the situation in Chiapas, Mexico.
Chiapas, located in southern Mexico, is often referred to as the country's wettest region. Despite this abundance, tap water here is almost never safe to drink. Chiapas is home to over 5 million people, half of whom live in rural areas, and many who belong to indigenous communities. Despite being surrounded by abundant water resources, many of these communities have little to no access to safe drinking water. Born and raised in San Miguel Mitontic, a village of predominantly indigenous Tzotzil ethnicity in Chiapas, José Luis Mendez Rodriguez grew up without access to running water. The Tzotzil are a Mayan people indigenous to what is nowadays referred to as Chiapas.
Bueno, soy originario de un municipio que se llama San Miguel Mitontic.
He began to explain the problem of water access in Chiapas with the example of his community. As far as his grandparents can remember, the community was created at least 100 years ago. Yet it wasn't until the 1990s that efforts started to be made to build water infrastructure. And even then, it was only a rainwater collection system implemented by the municipality. This was the community's first experience with any kind of water system.
Entonces, hasta ese punto, ya pensando como en las personas que lo hemos vivido, pues usábamos agua, consumíamos agua de los pozos, de las pequeñas fuentes de agua que sí hay varios, hay que caminar, hay que acarrear, pero sí hay en la región, con obviamente retos, con la posibilidad de que no necesariamente sea agua segura para beber, para la salud.
So, the people who lived before and until then consumed water from small sources that exist in the area. Yes, there are several that you must walk to and carry the water back home from. But yes, there are sources of water in the region. There are obvious challenges with the likelihood that the water is not necessarily healthy or safe to drink.
Uno de los ejemplos que hay en toda la región de confiar en lo que te da el manantial y te la bebes así, tal cual, ¿no? Sin verificar la calidad del agua. Y eso persiste hasta ahorita en donde no tienes.
You have to trust in the spring and drink the water it gives you as is, without checking the quality of the water. And this problem persists until now in places with no water distribution.
Yo estudié en una escuela en donde justo no había el acceso al agua, cada quien tenía que llevar su agua para poder beber o sea, en los recesos, en el horario escolar. Y este ejemplo se repite mucho aún hasta hoy, 20 años después de lo que yo viví, aún hemos observado varias.
I studied at a school where there was no access to water. Every student had to bring their own water to be able to drink during the school day. Today, 20 years after I grew up in that situation, we still see many schools with still no water access at all. Now let's talk about the experience of women in these communities. The responsibility of collecting water falls on them, and the burden is immense. I spoke with Fermín Reigadas, the director of Cantaro Azul, a non-profit organization focused on providing safe access to water in rural Chiapas. The burden of collecting water, often from springs miles away, falls on women and children. Imagine needing to trek for miles every day just to fetch a few liters of water that may not even be safe to drink. This is the reality for many in Chiapas.
States like Chiapas. So Chiapas is a state with a little bit more than 5 million people. half of them live in rural communities, and almost everyone in rural communities doesn't have access to clean, safe drinking water. It's still, I mean, we're in 2024, and people still need to fetch water from local springs or wells. It's mostly this responsibility is pushed or left for women to do, and it carries like big risks and a big impact in their health. Also sometimes risk to children, like taking children every day to walking more than half an hour in uneven terrain, has led to accidents, and also leaving them at home by themselves has also created accidents, and just the amount of water that you can carry to your home in a day, it's between 20 to 50 liters, which is a very small amount of water to for people to meet their daily needs, and this has a very important impact on health as well, which combined with the fact that most of the water that people drink in these rural communities is contaminated with pathogens that cause gastrointestinal illness. This, drinking water with pathogens leads to chronic diarrhea, and particularly when kids grow up with limited nutrients, when they also have diarrhea, they're losing most of those nutrients, and so they develop malnutrition, and as they grow up, they face limits in their cognitive and physical development, and so these problems arise from inequalities, but further deepen inequalities because it do not allow both women and children as they grow up to be able to live their full potential and to be able to participate in a more equal relation with the rest of the society. So we are dealing with like deep injustices that we're facing, and governments have not incorporated a perspective of like the human right to water and sanitation, which could play a significant role in transforming the reality and tackling these challenges that we're seeing.
Dr. Marisa Mazzari-Hiriart, a biologist and professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, who has studied water quality in Chiapas for over a decade, shares her observations. She talks about how the lack of water access not only affects daily life, but also disrupts education and perpetuates poverty, especially among women and girls.
El darnos cuenta que a pesar de que las condiciones han mejorado un poco, las niñas y las mujeres en general siguen siendo las responsables de proveer agua en las comunidades. Y las niñas y las mujeres siguen siendo las más afectadas en cuanto a esta situación de no distribución de agua de manera mucho más eficiente. Los niños en general, niños y niñas, pero en general son más las niñas y las mujeres. Esto yo lo había visto en Chiapas hace 30 años y la situación ha mejorado, pero no se ha solucionado, ¿no? El acarreo de agua, por ejemplo, que por ayudar las niñas no vayan a las escuelas, que en las escuelas no haya agua, en los baños, que no haya agua en las escuelas.
Even though the conditions have improved a little, girls and women in general remain responsible for providing water in communities, and are still the most affected by this situation of lack of distribution of water. Boys too, but in general it is more girls and women that bear this burden. I had seen this in Chiapas 30 years ago, and the situation has improved, but it has not been resolved. For example, to help fetch water, girls stop going to school, and in the schools there is no water access either. Economically, the Grijalva Usumacinta water system is vital for tourism in Chiapas. The stunning Lagos de Montebello, a system of 52 lakes, attracts visitors from around the world. However, contamination and lack of proper sanitation are threatening both the environment and the livelihoods of those who depend on tourism. Dr. Mazzari-Hiriart explained the impact.
El grupo de trabajo del Instituto de Ecología llevamos 10 años trabajando en Chiapas. Empezamos en 2014 Y la primera investigación se refirió a la calidad de agua de un sistema de 52 lagos que existe en...
From the Institute of Ecology has been working in Chiapas for 10 years. We started in 2014, and our first study focused on the water quality of a system of 52 lakes located in Chiapas, near the border with Guatemala. This is the Montebello Lake System, which is significant both geologically and touristically. It is also very important as it serves as a water source for some poor and marginalized communities in the area. Locals rely on tourism, showcasing the beauty of the lakes and selling food. One of the major concerns has been that the lakes, which used to be clear and beautifully turquoise or green, have become opaque. The northern part of the lakes has turned green and murky. The contrast between how the government handles water crises in wealthy regions versus poorer areas like Chiapas is stark. Here's Regadas discussing the disparity.
From an indigenous community is facing a problem, any type of problem, they will not receive the same attention and the same mobilization from society or the government. And so we live in a country that it's deeply racist. In addition to that, our democracy does not work well for minorities. And when these minorities are groups like indigenous populations or rural communities that are dispersed, then the government does not respond respond to the needs. We see it very clearly. 2 years ago, there was a drop in Monterrey, one of the wealthiest cities and largest cities in Mexico. It's one of the few cities that has pipe water every day, and that the water is safe to drink. And they, for a summer, they run out of surface water, and so they had to ration the water and distribute it only a few hours a day, really early in the morning. And you know, a lot of people like took videos of what was happening. They were not getting water. They were facing struggles because they didn't have water. They didn't have places where to store the water. And very quickly, within 2 months, the federal government invested 10,000 million pesos, which is about 500, a little like 600 Canadian or US dollars, roughly. Just in 2 months of seeing this challenge, the government was able to have this big response, one of the largest investments in the past decade on water, and to build, you know, an aqueduct, to build a dam and an aqueduct to bring water to Monterrey. And in contrast to that, in Chiapas, but also in other states like Oaxaca, Guerrero, even Veracruz, you know, there is equivalent number of people living in rural communities, and the government is investing $5 million a year. So there is a, you know, within 1 year, the equivalent of 100 years of budget of Chiapas was funneled or from the federal government to the state, because it reached like national audience in the news, whereas people here in rural communities face much more dire conditions in terms of water and sanitation, and they have lived through them for decades, and the response does not occur. So yeah, I think it's at the core of it. I think it's racism and a democracy that does not work, and like democracy and weakness of institutions that does not really work for minorities.
Regadas also criticized the bureaucratic processes that the government puts communities through and the failure to meet their needs with unsatisfactory infrastructure.
Unfortunately, they have normalized the situation. They have, I think it is very often you see a community that suddenly develops certain hope that change can come, and they mobilize and they organize themselves and create a proposal on how to overcome a specific challenge that could be getting access to water, and they contact government officials, and then, you know, government officials at the municipality, they say like, well, we don't have funding for this, you have to go to the state institution, and so they go to the the State Water Institute in Chiapas or to the Roads and Water Infrastructure Commission. And then they say, well, it's not really our responsibility. You should go to the Water National Commission. So they go to the Water National Commission, and then they say, no, it's really the municipality that just should solve it. And so they, after a couple of years of doing that, they get tired of like seeing no results, and hope goes down, and then they kind of normalize, and they, in a way, they also externalize the cost of this to the children, who are the ones that are most impacted. And so things like chronic diarrhea in many communities is seen as something that it's common, that naturally happens in children within certain age group, which of course is not the case. It is not, diarrhea is not part of growing up. So when communities or water communities are not organized within each other, we see things like, for example, like sometimes there's a little bit of funding from the federal government, the state government adds a little bit more, and the municipality says, like, let's have a project in this pipe water system in this community. And when that happens, usually the terms of designing the pipe water system respond more to technical specifications that are decided in the office of these government institutions, and many times do not reflect the needs or the resources available in the community. We have seen many times that, for example, there's a community that has some water springs up above, perhaps a few kilometers away. And in order to get water from that spring, there has to be an agreement with another community, either where the spring is located or through where the pipes are going to go through. These agreements take a little bit of time, but it is possible to reach them. And if they're reached, then the water flows by gravity and it reaches the community, and it's much easier to operate and sustain a system in the long term like that. But in a project that was designed in a government office, mostly to provide benefits to the company, the construction company that is going to implement them, then they make decisions like, well, we could use that water in that spring, but it's going to take us longer. We don't really know how to reach an agreement with the other community. So why don't we bring water from the river that is downhill? And well, we will need a pump. Yeah, we can put it on the budget. Let's put it on the budget. And then they implement a pipe water system that needs to pump water from downhill. And then now the community has to pay for the electricity, and they have to pay for the pump that is damaged. And those, when we're talking about a community that is cash limited, it is much more difficult to sustain. So we see a lot of infrastructure that is not working because it was not well designed. It did not take into consideration the needs and the resources that the community had. We also see what I described earlier, that when the community is the one that is leading the creation of a project, then they're shifted or sent from one institution to another institution with no real consequence to the government entities of not really responding to the needs of the communities. And so in contrast to that, these are the first seeds that are starting to blossom. But we see in two municipalities, one Tzotzil, and one Celtal, these are Maya and Indigenous communities. They have formed the first associations of water committees in Mexico. And because they have formed these associations, first we started to see more organizations like Cántaro Azul working with them, because organizations see that there is a structure of organization that will increase the possibility of the project to be successful. And then we also start to see how the municipal president or the director of the Water National Commission, now, because the communities are organized, they are open to listening to what their needs are. We still are waiting to see a clear response that it's effective in resolving all their needs, but at the very least, we're seeing these steps of dialogue.
Distrust of outside interventions is also a significant barrier. Dr. Mazari Hiriart shared her experience with Indigenous communities who were hesitant to adopt water treatment methods, such as chlorination.
Pero también los pobladores indígenas son bastante reticentes, bastante negativos en cuanto a entrar en orden en las cosas. Por ejemplo, durante la pandemia se intentó hacer fumigaciones fuera de algunos de los comercios que tenían los de grupos indígenas y llegaban a fumigar y lo que hacían era cerrar su puerta, ¿no? Era una reacción como de no queremos eso. Otra reacción que nosotros hemos encontrado es, por ejemplo, en los sistemas de distribución de agua generalmente se hace una cloración. A ellos no les gusta. No es la manera como ellos quisieran tener el agua disponible para sus necesidades. No quieren el agua clorada, ¿no? Entonces, también tienen sus condiciones. Ellos quieren agua, pero bajo su propio régimen, bajo sus propias condiciones. En muchos lugares, especialmente en las comunidades indígenas, están organizados de manera local y tienen sus reglas locales. Y ellos saben de dónde se distribuye el agua, cuándo se distribuye el agua y cómo se distribuye el agua y quién es el responsable. Entonces, hay una organización dentro de estas poblaciones que también choca un poco con, digamos, la organización gubernamental para proveer de agua.
But also, the indigenous inhabitants are quite resistant and negative. For example, during the pandemic, there was an attempt to carry out fumigations outside some businesses in indigenous communities. When they arrived to fumigate, the community members closed their doors. It was a reaction of, we don't want this. Another reaction we've encountered is related to water distribution systems. Generally, water is chlorinated, which they don't like. It's not the way they prefer to have water available to meet their needs. They don't want chlorinated water. They want water, but under their own regulations, under their own conditions. In some places, especially in indigenous communities, they are already organized locally and have their own local rules. They know where, when, and how the water is distributed, and who is responsible for it. The existing political organization within these communities somewhat clashes with the government's organization when it comes to providing services. Regadas tells us his organization, Cántaro Azul, tries to build trust and implement change according to people's wants and needs. First,
organizations like Cántaro Azul, we work a lot in like step by step in first showing with the communities with limited resources, but showing that change can happen, that change driven within the community can happen, that the conditions of managing water can be improved, that people can do either rainwater harvesting or there can be a small system that brings water from the spring closer to their home. Once they see that that's possible, at the beginning they're very skeptical to organize themselves and to invest time, invest money in something that in the past has not worked and has not come as a solution. But when there is like this commitment, transparency, direct work with the communities, particularly with the committees that they form to manage water, then the community can see that there's a possibility of a transformation, of a positive transformation. And then after that, the communities start to think, well, what is the next thing that we need? Maybe we need to improve the quality of the water, or maybe we need to protect our water source, or there is a challenge that we cannot address with our current resources. So we have to, yes, we have to go and talk to the government because it's their obligation, as it's stated in our constitution. But the key difference here is that we know that if they go by themselves, it won't work. So one of the things that we have been promoting is that these water committees, they get together and they share experiences, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and also that they, that they join forces to have a unified voice and then go to the authorities as a unified voice. And we have seen that this makes a very big difference because there is a big power asymmetry between one community and a government institution. But when like 20, 30 communities get together, then the government officials start to pay attention. And that gives rise to the possibility of reaching agreements between the public entity and the communities.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes.